At the northern extreme of Colombia, in the department of La Guajira, one of the world's largest open-pit coal mines exposes, on its terraced walls, dozens of meters of Paleocene rock. There, at Cerrejón, teams of geologists and paleontologists began working in the early 2000s with a clear goal: to reconstruct what tropical rainforests were like shortly after the extinction of the dinosaurs, about 60 million years ago. Each layer of coal, shale, and sand contained compressed remains of leaves, trunks, seeds, turtles, fish, and other vertebrates, which together offered the oldest known image of a neotropical rainforest. In that context, during one of the campaigns, fossils appeared that immediately drew attention. Among fragments of dark rock emerged a disproportionately large vertebra, more robust and wide than anyone expected to find in a Paleocene river and swamp deposit. It was not an isolated find. In the following days, more vertebrae, thick ribs, and scattered elements clearly belonging to large animals began to appear. Based on accumulated experience in the area, the initial reaction was almost automatic. It was assumed they were remains of large crocodilomorphs, since Cerrejón had previously provided partial dinosaur skulls and skeletons up to 5 meters in length. However, something did not fit. As the fossils were cleaned and systematically compared with reference collections, the proportions of the vertebral bodies, the shape of the processes, and the general curves did not match those typical of crocodiles. The vertebral morphology resembled that of a snake, but amplified to a scale never seen before. When herpetology and fossil vertebrate specialists examined the series of bones, reinterpretation became inevitable. They were not giant crocodiles, but the vertebrae of a colossal snake belonging to a lineage of primitive boas. Subsequent campaigns at Cerrejón confirmed that this was not a single individual or an extreme case within a moderately sized species. In total, nearly 200 elements attributable to this snake were recovered from at least 30 individuals of different sizes. Most were vertebrae and ribs, as is usual in the fossil record of snakes, but the repetition of the same diagnostic traits allowed for the clear definition of a new species. Based on these pieces, in 2009, the genus and species Titanoboa were described, the name combining the idea of Titan with the boa group and incorporating the geographic reference to Cerrejón. The type material consisted of a large dorsal vertebra, used as a reference for the first length estimates. Using the statistically known relationship between vertebrae size and total length in modern boas and anacondas, the researchers calculated that, even taking conservative values, the snake reached at least 13 meters. Less conservative estimates exceeded 15 meters and suggested masses close to or over 1,100 kilograms. Given such extreme figures, calculations were repeated several times, comparing them with long series of modern skeletons, until the team was convinced there were no arithmetic errors. The animal was indeed colossal. To put the discovery in perspective, it is enough to compare it with the largest living snakes, the green anaconda, or Eunectes mirinus, the heaviest snake today, and the reticulated python, or Malaeopithon reticulatus, one of the longest, rarely exceed 6 or 7 meters in verified measurements, with masses that may approach or surpass 200 kilograms in exceptional cases. Titanoboa practically doubled those lengths and multiplied the body mass several times, redefining the known upper limit for the size of a snake. The stratigraphic provenance of the fossils placed Titanoboa in the middle to late Paleocene, about 60 million years ago, just a few million years after the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. The environment in which it lived was not an isolated fossil desert, but a coastal plain traversed by large, slow-moving rivers surrounded by dense, humid, tropical forest. Cerrejón layers preserve remains of leaves, pollen, fruits, and wood, showing that many of the plant families dominant in today's neotropical rainforests were already present, although with lower species diversity. Alongside Titanoboa, shells and skulls of giant turtles appeared, some with carapace lengths close to 2 meters, as well as remains of several crocodiliforms of different sizes and shapes, from small, short-snouted species to 5-meter predators, with jaws adapted to crush hard-shelled prey. This combination of slow rivers, turbid waters, and large fauna depicts a highly productive ecosystem where a super predator weighing more than a ton could find sufficient food and move relatively efficiently thanks to the buoyancy of the water. The scientific impact of the discovery was twofold. On one hand, the description of Titanoboa cerrejonensis provided the clearest and most extreme record of gigantism in snakes, demonstrating how large snakes could grow under certain environmental conditions. On the other hand, it offered an unexpected tool to estimate temperatures in Paleocene equatorial forests. Because snakes are ectotherms and their maximum size is constrained by environmental temperature, Titanoboa's body became a kind of biological thermometer, indicating annual averages of at least 34 degrees Celsius in the region. As the collection expanded and new studies were published, Cerrejón ceased to be just a coal mine and became a natural laboratory on the early evolution of tropical ecosystems after the disappearance of the dinosaurs. Titanoboa took center stage in that story as the emblematic super predator of a warmer, wetter world dominated by giant reptiles. However, in this first approach, the image remains essentially that of a series of colossal vertebrae extracted from a coal wall. Anatomy, size, and physiology of an ectothermic giant. Reconstructing the body of Titanoboa starts from one essential fact. It was not a strange snake in its basic plan, but a gigantic member of the Boidae family, the group that includes modern boas and anacondas. Its vertebrae, although disproportionate, retain the typical features of these ophidians: relatively short and wide vertebral bodies, robust articular processes, and a precloacal series that concentrates most of the total length. Detailed comparison with modern skeletons allowed many of the fossil vertebrae to be placed toward the posterior half of the trunk, around 65% of the body length, a crucial point for extrapolating the animal's total size. Titanoboa's vertebrae are distinguished by their enormous robustness and by a T-shaped neural spine, expanded backward, which serves as an anchor for highly developed musculature. This morphology indicates a massive trunk of large diameter, closer to the silhouette of an oversized anaconda than that of a slender python. The wide neural canal suggests a spinal cord proportionally similar to that of other boids, but enclosed in a much larger bony structure. The lateral foramina, smaller than in many living relatives, and the general proportions reinforce the idea of an animal built to withstand enormous compressive and torsional forces along its body. For several years, Titanoboa was known only from vertebrae and ribs, but later expeditions recovered fragments of the skull, a type of fossil exceptionally rare in snakes. Although the detailed description of these skulls is limited, the available information indicates a high number of teeth on the palate and along the jaw margins, and a quadrate bone oriented at a low angle, suggesting a wide gape and adaptations for grasping slippery prey. The reduced articulation between some palatal bones points to a relatively rigid skull compared to other boas, consistent with a feeding style focused on voluminous but relatively simple-shaped prey, rather than animals with very irregular forms. Length estimates were based on the principle that in boas and pythons, increases in size are achieved mainly by enlarging the vertebrae, rather than multiplying their number. Comparing Titanoboa vertebrae with those of modern boas in equivalent positions in the spine, initial calculations gave an average length of about 12.8 meters, with a plausible range between 11 and 15 meters. Body mass, estimated by analogy with large anacondas and pythons, was placed in an approximate range of 650 to over 1,100 kilograms, with central values around 1.1 tons. Later studies and modeling, including three-dimensional reconstructions, suggested that some individuals could approach or even exceed 14 meters, confirming Titanoboa as one of the largest snakes known in the fossil record. In comparative terms, this means that Titanoboa almost doubled the length of most verified green anacondas and quadrupled or quintupled the mass of the heaviest living snakes. It was not just a little bigger. It redefined the known biological ceiling for an ophidian. Such magnitude forces consideration of the mechanics of its body. A trunk over 10 meters long, a very thick cross-section, implies immense musculature capable of generating constriction pressures far exceeding those of any modern boa or python. Biomechanical models derived from vertebral robustness and inferred body thickness have estimated pressures of several hundred PS1, sufficient to collapse the thorax of large reptiles and giant turtles. But size is not only a matter of bone and muscle, it is also a matter of physiology. Titanoboa, like all snakes, was an ectothermic animal, meaning its body temperature and metabolism depended on environmental heat. At a small scale, a boa can compensate for slightly lower temperatures through behavior, basking, choosing protected microhabitats, alternating between shade and water. At the scale of Titanoboa, with a body over a ton in weight, these strategies have limits. The larger the body volume, the more energy is required to heat all tissues and maintain them in an optimal range for digestion, movement, and muscle function. For this reason, Titanoboa's gigantism has been used as a biological thermometer for the tropical Paleocene. Comparing maximum size with mean annual temperatures of neotropical forests and extrapolating that relationship to Titanoboa's estimated length, researchers calculated that the equatorial region around 60 million years ago must have had mean temperatures of at least 34 degrees Celsius, clearly above modern rainforest temperatures. These figures reasonably match independent estimates derived from oxygen isotopes in marine microfossils and climate models that propose very high atmospheric CO2 concentrations for the Paleocene. The idea that a snake's size can reveal the temperature of its environment has been discussed and nuanced. Some studies point out that behavior, body shape, and the ability to warm up through controlled sun exposure can partly modify this relationship. However, even considering these factors, the general conclusion holds. A boid over 12 meters long is only stably viable in an environment that is warm almost constantly, with mild nights and no pronounced cold seasons. Titanoboa thus illustrates the extent to which an ectotherm can grow when the thermal limitations that today restrict its relatives are removed. Another key aspect of its physiology is the relationship between size, body density, and the medium in which it moves. An animal so heavy would have difficulty moving efficiently on land. Its own weight would compress internal organs when the body rests on the substrate, friction would be high, and locomotion energy intensive. In contrast, in an aquatic or semi-aquatic environment, buoyancy drastically reduces effective weight, relieves pressure on tissues, and allows a very large snake to move with relatively economical undulatory motions. Hence, although its anatomy does not show extreme adaptations of a fully marine snake, everything points to a lifestyle strongly linked to warm rivers and swamps. In this context, its metabolism would have operated at high speed, rapid digestion after large meals, relatively accelerated growth during the first years, and the ability to alternate phases of intense activity with long periods of inactivity while processing voluminous prey. Extreme size was not an accident, but the logical consequence of ectothermic physiology functioning at maximum in an exceptionally warm climate, with abundant resources and an aquatic environment that supported much of its weight. Understanding this combination of body, size, and metabolism inevitably leads to the next step: analyzing in detail the specific ecological scenario in which Titanoboa lived, hunted, and competed with other large Paleocene reptiles. The world of Titanoboa, swampy jungles of the Paleocene. Stepping back into the world of Titanoboa means placing oneself on a planet subject to a greenhouse-type climate. In the middle of the Paleocene, about 60 million years ago, average global temperatures were several degrees higher than today, and in the equatorial belt, annual values are estimated to have been above 30 degrees Celsius, with very little seasonal variation. Permanent polar ice caps did not exist, and the contrast between seasons was weak. The tropics did not experience winters, only an alternation of more or less rainy periods within a framework of constantly high temperatures. In this context, the region that today corresponds to northern Colombia was part of an extensive low-elevation coastal plain, influenced by the Proto-Caribbean Sea, covered by tropical wet forests, and crossed by high-discharge river systems. The rocks of the Cerrejón Formation record this plain as a combination of slow-flowing river channels, floodplains, and permanent swamps. The rivers described wide meanders, laden with fine sediments, leaving behind sandbars and deposits of organic mud. In the lower areas, shallow waters, waterlogged zones, and lagoons filled with plant remains accumulated, where partial decomposition of biomass favored coal formation. It was a landscape dominated by saturated soils, with a high water table and frequent overflows, where the boundary between water and dry land was diffuse. Conditions were ideal for fauna adapted to aquatic and semi-aquatic life, and for the expansion of an evergreen forest that barely experienced periods of water stress. The vegetation revealed by impressions of leaves, seeds, and trunks indicates that this was one of the first well-developed neotropical jungles. Many of the families dominant in today's wet forests were already present: palms, laurels, members of the zingiberales, aroids, and legumes, among others. However, species diversity was lower than that of a modern Amazonian rainforest. These were communities still in the process of diversification after the Great Extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. The forest had several layers, with a closed canopy that limited light penetration, a dense understory of large leaves, and a substrate covered by moist leaf litter, exposed roots, and fallen trunks. This structure created shaded and extremely humid microhabitats, ideal for large ectothermic reptiles that could move between the water and riparian vegetation. The terrestrial and aquatic fauna of Cerrejón reflects an ecosystem clearly dominated by reptiles. Among the most striking components were giant freshwater turtles, such as forms related to carbonomes, which reached shells over 1.5 meters long and robust skulls capable of crushing prey with hard shells. These turtles occupied lagoons and river margins, feeding on vegetation and hard-bodied animals, and constituted a concentrated trophic resource for any predator capable of overcoming their armor. Alongside them, other large turtles and even smaller forms are recorded, occupying complementary niches within the same wetland system. Crocodiliforms provided another essential component of the landscape. 3 genera of dinosaurs shared the river channels with Titanoboa, one with a long snout and slender body, probably adapted to capture fish in open waters, another with a broader head and powerful jaws capable of exerting significant bite forces on robust prey, and a third smaller in size, perhaps more tied to the shores or shallow waters. This assemblage suggests niche partitioning among aquatic predators, with species specialized in different types of prey and microhabitats within the same river and swamp system. The remains of these animals often appear in the same stratigraphic levels as the vertebrae of Titanoboa, confirming their spatial and temporal coexistence. In the turbid waters of Cerrejón, sizable fish also lived, including large lungfish and other freshwater bony fishes, as well as smaller forms occupying the middle and surface layers of the water column. Above the tree canopy, a still little-known group of birds and small mammals began to diversify. But in terms of biomass and body size, reptiles remained the dominant vertebrates. Mammals were mostly small to medium-sized organisms, tied to the understory and branches, without the capacity to compete directly with large aquatic predators. The trophic network was organized around highly efficient primary producers, large herbivorous reptiles, and a series of aquatic and semi-aquatic carnivores exploiting the abundance of biomass concentrated in the wetlands. This set of factors creates the context in which Titanoboa is understood not as an isolated anomaly, but as the apex of an ecological pyramid adapted to extreme conditions. The wetlands provided physical support for its mass, and a three-dimensional environment where a bulky predator could hide among submerged roots and logs. High temperatures reduced the physiological constraints typical of a giant ectotherm, allowing metabolic rates sufficient to sustain a body weighing over a ton. The presence of large turtles and crocodiliforms guaranteed energy-rich prey, capable of compensating for the effort associated with each capture. Hunting strategies, diet, and behavior. In the swampy ecosystem of the Paleocene, Titanoboa was not a wandering hunter covering large distances, but a specialized ambush predator. Its size made it an inefficient animal for moving quickly on land. A body over 10 meters long, with a diameter comparable to that of an industrial drum, would have had to constantly struggle against gravity to move among roots and logs, with a very high energy expenditure. In contrast, in water, buoyancy compensated for part of its mass, reduced pressure on internal organs, and allowed it to move more efficiently. All evidence indicates that its behavior was more similar to that of a large crocodile than a modern terrestrial snake. Slow, stealthy, and almost always partially submerged. In the murky water channels of Cerrejón, Titanoboa could hide among submerged roots, fallen logs, and banks of aquatic vegetation. Visibility in this environment would have been low, favoring a predator that relied more on stealth and contact than on long-distance visual pursuit. As with modern anacondas, part of the head and neck could barely rise above the surface while the rest of the body remained hidden. Under these conditions, prey detection would have relied on perceiving vibrations, water waves, and perhaps minimal chemical changes in the immediate environment rather than on detailed vision. The key factor was proximity. Titanoboa did not need to see its prey from afar, only to be close enough when it entered its range. The hunting sequence, according to biomechanical models and comparisons with modern boids, began with a prolonged waiting phase. The animal could remain motionless for hours, even days, with muscles relaxed but ready for explosive contraction. When a giant turtle, a medium-sized crocodiliform, or a large fish approached the shoreline or a narrow channel, a sudden movement was enough to close the distance. The first contact could consist of a lateral body strike or a quick bite with the jaws, aimed at any accessible part of the prey. The goal was not to cause immediate damage, but to secure the prey long enough to begin coiling. Once the first point of contact was secured, constriction came into play. Titanoboa's body was designed to withstand and generate great forces. The thickness of the vertebrae, the shape of the neural spine, and the overall robustness of the backbone indicate a segmented musculature capable of exerting enormous pressure. Extrapolating from modern boas and pythons, which can exert constriction pressures sufficient to collapse the circulatory system of medium-sized mammals, it is estimated that Titanoboa could easily exceed 400 psi, a force strong enough to fracture the ribs of large reptiles and quickly compromise both blood circulation and lung ventilation. Under these conditions, the outcome for the prey was rapid: loss of consciousness due to circulatory collapse, and shortly afterward, death. Titanoboa's probable diet is inferred from the set of associated fossils in Cerrejón. Giant freshwater turtles, slow-moving and with soft tissue protected by robust shells, appear as obvious candidates. Their energy value was high, and their ability to flee was limited, especially in shallow waters or when leaving the water to move across sand and mud banks. Small to medium-sized dinosaur-like crocodiliforms offered another important resource. Although they were active predators, many of them lacked the size needed to turn the tables and hunt a massive adult boid. But they could be caught by surprise when approaching narrow passageways. In addition, there were large fish, common in productive river systems, and perhaps secondarily small mammals that used the banks and could fall into the water or come too close. Titanoboa's feeding rhythm would not have been constant. A predator of that size could afford long periods without eating after capturing an especially large prey. A giant turtle or a well-sized crocodilomorph would have been sufficient to meet its energy needs for weeks, even months, if environmental temperatures remained high and stable. During digestion, the snake likely minimized movement. seeking warm, relatively calm water areas where it could remain semi-submerged with its body coiled while the digestive process progressed. The ability to alternate brief periods of intense activity with long periods of apparent immobility is typical of large ectothermic predators, and in Titanoboa this must have been taken to the extreme. Regarding reproduction and life cycle, available fossils do not allow precise reconstruction, but analogies with modern boas provide some clues. Titanoboa was likely viviparous, like many modern boids, which would have allowed females to better regulate the developmental temperature of their offspring by choosing warmer or cooler microhabitats. Litters could have been numerous because in environments with high predation on juveniles, it is advantageous to produce many offspring, even if only a minimal fraction reaches adulthood. Young individuals of moderate size would have occupied slightly different niches, feeding on small fish and amphibians, until they grew large enough to exploit bigger prey and drastically reduce their natural predators. Global warming, extinction, and the legacy of Titanoboa. When the global climate began to cool after the Middle Paleocene, the ecological model that had allowed Titanoboa's gigantism started to crumble. Climate records indicate a gradual decline in average temperatures and changes in rainfall distribution, with more pronounced oscillations between wet and relatively dry periods. In the tropical belt, this translated into less homogeneous forests, more unstable wetlands, and greater variability in river and swamp levels. For an ectotherm weighing over a ton, whose physiology depended on a constant environmental heat, this change imposed intense selective pressure. In a cooler environment, Titanoboa's massive body became a disadvantage. Large body volume causes warming and cooling to be slow. With lower and more fluctuating temperatures, the snake required more time and energy to reach the optimal thermal ranges for digestion and movement. Every meal required not only capturing large prey, but also having sufficient hours of stable heat to process it. If those warm periods shortened or became less predictable, the energy balance became tighter, and the survival of the largest individuals grew increasingly difficult. At the same time, the structure of the food web changed. Giant turtles and some specialized crocodiliforms, closely tied to very warm wetlands, began to decline as environments fragmented and continuous swamp systems became mosaics of more diverse habitats. The decline of these high-calorie prey directly affected the large predators that depended on them. Meanwhile, warm-blooded mammals increased in diversity and occupied niches previously dominated by reptiles, taking better advantage of more moderate temperatures and greater environmental variability. Although many of these mammals did not directly compete with Titanoboa in size, they did modify the overall structure of the ecosystem and resource availability. The result of these combined pressures was not a sudden extinction, but a gradual decline. First, the largest and most specialized populations disappeared, unable to adapt to an environment that no longer offered extensive wetlands, stable temperatures, and abundant giant prey. Later, smaller forms, perhaps descendants or close relatives, gave way to other boids, better adapted to slightly cooler climates and a more fragmented landscape. In the fossil record, Titanoboa's disappearance is observed as a temporal boundary, after which its remains cease to appear in sediments, replaced by vertebrate assemblages in which giant reptiles are less frequent, and mammals take a more prominent role. Although the species went extinct tens of millions of years ago, its scientific legacy is recent. The study of Titanoboa has unexpectedly allowed scientists to quantify the link between climate and maximum size in ectotherms, refine reconstructions of the first neotropical forests, and better understand how relatively small global temperature changes can destabilize extreme organisms perfectly adapted to a specific climatic state. At the same time, its image has entered the popular imagination as a symbol of a warmer and more radical planet, reminding us that the history of life includes phases in which biological limits were very different from those of today.